Trinity is a support Warframe. We all know that. But since when does quote-unquote support mean being invincible, having infinite energy, armor stripping everyone around you, nuking the entire room, and dealing red crits? Yeah, let's talk about the new and reworked Trinity. As always, big shoutouts to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on, and now, let's jump right into it. As always, let's start out with her skills, where the first thing to talk about is naturally her passive, which got also completely revamped with the rework. Now, what this does is that a certain percentage of Trinity's maximum energy will be given as additional maximum health to you and allies in affinity range. All in all, this definitely doesn't hurt, but on the other hand, Trinity kind of isn't really a health tank to begin with, so in my opinion it's also nothing to write home about. Although I should mention that I saw a very interesting Reddit post by a user called Prime262 the other day, who had some very interesting ideas on how you could potentially build around this. I'm gonna link you the whole thing in the description down below, but on a day-to-day basis I would say this is more of a nice-to-have type of thing, but nothing revolutionary. Ability number 1, Well of Life. When you cast Well of Life onto an enemy, this enemy becomes invincible and stagnant in place until the skill runs out. When you or your allies are in the range around that enemy, you receive constant healing, as well as when you damage that enemy, you get an additional percentage of the damage that you dealt to that enemy as healing on top of that. You can have up to 3 of those Well of Lives on the field at the same time, and when you or an ally dies within the radius of one of those Wells of Life, then they actually don't die and the Well of Life dies in their stead. Specifically this, I think, is a great feature when you want to go into those very high levels, endurance, level cap and all that stuff, because it gives you this neat additional bit of oopsie protection. Now, Well of Life also has an augment called Pool of Life, and I'm gonna make it short, I don't think this one is worth the mod slot for most people out there, because all it does is it gives you health orbs and an energy orb when an enemy dies that is affected by Well of Life, and as you're gonna see in a minute here, Trinity already is a Warframe who has access to infinite energy and infinite heal, so why use a mod slot just to get some health and energy orbs? Lastly, there's one more feature to talk about with Well of Life, and that is that while you are in the circle of a Well of Life, you're also immune to status effects, and if you were to take a status effect, then instead the Well of Life enemy will take 10% of their total health as damage, or 5% if this is a boss enemy. Ability number 2 is called Energy Vampire, and this is one of the greatest energy regeneration skills in the entire game, also the reason why Trinity will never ever run out of energy. When you cast this on an enemy, they will start emitting energy pulses over a certain duration in fixed time intervals. Each and every one of those energy pulses will deal true damage to that enemy, as well as restore energy to you and your allies when they are in the AoE. If that enemy dies before the duration ends, then all energy pulses that would be still remaining in that duration will be dealt at once, giving you a huge energy refresh, and this rework now has really helped the skill a lot. See, beforehand, if you wanted to build an Energy Vampire Trinity, you would go for low duration, making it so that this skill is over right away and all the energy pulses will be emitted pretty much in an instant. However, now with the rework, you're actually gaining more pulses if you build for more duration, which synergizes much better with the rest of your kit, making Trinity a whole lot stronger, as you're also going to see in the build section later in the video. Now, Energy Vampire also has an augment mod called Vampire Leech, and this one is very nice because what it does is excess energy, if your energy is already maxed out and you gain more energy from those pulses, that excess energy is going to be converted into shields that also go into overshields by 150%. So if you gain 100 excess energy, that means 150 shields for you. Now, about this augment, I personally think it's a great fit, especially when you want to play Trinity into shield tanking, but given that your ultimate, your 4th ability, can instantly refill your entire shield pool in just a split second, I would say if you don't want to go for it, it's also not really a must. Ability number 3 is called Link, and this one is also exceptionally awesome. When you cast Link, then you have an aura that automatically links you to enemies around you. What being linked to the enemy does is, you gain up to 75% damage reduction, which is huge because it makes you a lot more tanky and survivable. Also, just like with your first ability, you gain status effect immunity because status effects that go onto you are also redirected towards the enemy that you're linked to. Therefore, guess what? We're not gonna go for Prime Sure-Footed today. It's a good day to be a Trinity player. Now, another cool synergy that you can use here is, if you use your first ability to turn enemies into your wells of life, and then you get close to them so that your link actually links to that enemy, then a portion of that damage is going to be linked to your well of life enemy, therefore damaging them, which through the well of life mechanic is then going to give you further heal for the damage that the well of life enemy takes through the link. It's all in all a nice little synergy, but only really worth it if you play your Trinity into a health tanking playstyle. If that's not what you're going for, then you're probably not going to need it. The amount of enemies that you can link to is based on your ability strength, so the higher that is, the more enemies you can link to, which is important because of the augment, which is called a baiting link, and that gives you armor reduction on all those enemies that you are linked to. This is really cool, and I would totally recommend you to play this in higher levels where the enemy armor actually matters, so that you not only gain status immunity, massive damage reduction, but also you armor strip the enemies at the same time. And finally, let's get to her big ultimate, which is called Blessing, and this one is it's just absolutely disgusting how strong this skill is. When you tap this skill, your shields and health, as well as your allies' shields and health, in affinity range, will be filled up to 80% of their maximum by default. With a little bit of ability strength, you can easily get to 100% so that everything would be instantly full again. This, all in of itself, is already huge, right? At the press of a button, everything is full again, and you can press it again and again and again, making it so that even at the highest levels, you can easily shield gate over and over and over again with Trinity, no problem. However, there is more. In fact, this is not only a shield gating skill, this one too can give you up to 75% damage reduction, which would stack on top of the damage reduction that you're probably already going to have from your link, making you immensely tanky. And because of the fact that this is not only a skill for you, but also for allies in affinity range, you can make it that pretty much everyone on the entire map will benefit from it, because it is affinity range, not the normal skill range. So you could, for example, use the Mending Unity passive from your focus tree to increase your affinity range, as well as pop a Phosphor Flare, which is a gear item, to increase that affinity range by another 200 meters for 2 minutes. Yeah, it's really that good. Now, Blessing also has an augment called Champion's Blessing, and this one is really cool if you want to deal a whole lot of damage with your weapons, because it massively increases the crit chance of your weapons depending on how much percent you've healed yourself and allies with the cast of Blessing. Here's how that works. For each percent of their maximum health that you heal yourself or your allies, you gain 1% crit chance through this mod. This crit chance, by the way, is additive to mods, so it works basically like you have point strike on your weapon. However, this crit percentage, you can actually stack it up the more you cast the skill, right? So for example, if you cast the skill first and you heal 3% of the health from somebody, that gives you 3% more crit chance. But if you cast it again at the second cast and healed someone else for 7%, then that's gonna add on the 3% that you already have to 10% crit chance, and this then goes up and up and up until you reach the cap. And the cool thing here is, every time that you cast Blessing, no matter if you even heal in the first place or not at all, the countdown from this crit chance buff is going to be reset to the maximum, so you can easily keep this up constantly if you just cast your Blessing now and then. I would totally recommend it. And as always, I would also recommend liking the video because it helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. But alright, we just went in great detail over all her abilities and what you can do with them, how they synergize with one another, and this might have been a little bit much. So let's for 1 minute go over how you might want to play your Trinity in practice. See, one thing that you want to make sure that you have up all the time is your link. This not only gives you massive damage reduction, but also with the augment armor strip to the enemies around you, as well as status immunity, so you should never have this one run out. Whenever your energy goes low, you cast your Energy Vampire onto an enemy to fill that back up. And I would also recommend refreshing your third and fourth ability always at the same time, so you have the 75% damage reduction from both of them on constantly. Depending on which augments you use, you might get some crit chance out of your 4, and you might armor strip enemies with your 3. It's basically down to your personal preference. However, when it comes to your 1, I would only really recommend using this if you're playing your Trinity into health tanking. If you play her into shield gating or shield tanking, I don't see much of a need for it, except maybe for those very high level cases where you use those reservoirs to protect you from actual death. But outside of that, or just the fact that you maybe want to be the healer of your team, of course, I would say while the Wells of Life are surely nothing to scoff at, if you want to use a helmet ability, then this would be the best slot to use it in. Now, before we talk about the builds that I prepared for you today, one topic that I absolutely wanted to mention here because the numbers are crazy would be survivability, especially the insane amounts of damage reduction that you can receive with Trinity. See, in Warframe, every source of damage reduction scales multiplicatively with other sources of damage reduction, meaning that if you have one source that gives you 50% damage reduction and another source that gives you 50% damage reduction, you're not going to have 100% damage reduction. Instead, the first source is going to halve your damage, and then the second source is going to halve that already halved damage, so that you would have a situation where only 25% of the original damage gets through to you. And with Trinity having so many different sources of damage reduction, let's for 1 second do the math here and see how absolutely minuscule the percentage of damage is that ever only gets through to you. By default, shields in Warframe have a 50% damage reduction, so even without anything else, your shields will already halve the damage that you take. However, you will have 75% damage reduction from your 3, which turns the percentage of damage that you actually receive from 50% down to 12.5%. But that's not all. Of course, you also have your 4 up all the time, which gives you another 75% damage reduction, aka you now only take around 3% of the original damage. But we could, for example, also use a mod like Adaptation, which gives you another layer of further damage reduction. And to be fair, it's always hard to give an exact number on how much exact damage reduction this mod will give you. It will always fluctuate up and down a little bit. But in general, I assume Adaptation always to be around a 60% damage reduction on average, which would then take your 3% damage received down to around 1%. And as if that's not crazy enough, if you wanted to go really all out on damage reduction, you could use Mirage's skill Eclipse, infuse it onto probably your first skill, which would give you another 75% damage reduction on top of that, or in other words, you only take 0.3% of the original damage that the enemy dealt to you against your shields, which, by the way, is also the reason why I personally prefer playing Trinity as a shield tank. At the end of the day, what that means in numbers is that if you have, let's say, 1500 shields on your Trinity, with all that damage reduction that I just mentioned, those 1500 shields would actually equate to around 500,000 effective hit points. And don't forget, you can refill the entire shield pool at just the press of a button constantly. It is absolutely crazy. But okay, now that all that is said, let's finally talk about the build section where I have 2 builds prepared for you. The first one is a crazy resistant shield tanking, armor stripping, red critting gun runner build that will make even Uncle Harrow jealous. And then the second one is the AoE NUKE build that I also teased in the intro. But let's first start with the red crit tank. The way this build works is that we stack a whole lot of damage reduction as explained in the chapter before, and we're using 3 augments for her 2, 3, and 4. The one for the energy vampire so that we can generate overshields to have even more effective hit points, the one for Link for the armor stripping, and then of course, Champion's Blessing for the fat plus 350% crit chance. However, this also brings a bit of a problem. See, as I explained in the skills section of the video, the crit chance buff that you get from Champion's Blessing is equal to the percentage of health healed with your 4th ability for you and allies. In other words, you need to heal HP with your 4th ability, otherwise you're not going to get the crit chance buff. And with all the damage reduction that we're rocking on this build, we aren't taking any health damage that we could heal up. Now, you might think, no problem, just throw on combat discipline, inflict a little bit of self-damage every time you kill an enemy, but our damage reduction unfortunately also applies to combat discipline, meaning on this build here, we're not gonna get any health drain from it. Another thing that we could do would be using the Hema, because this, every time you reload it, drains a little bit of your maximum HP. It could work, but it also takes an eternity to get enough damage out of it for your 350% buff. So, what are we gonna do? Well, to be fair, the simplest solution that I could find was simply use a companion, ideally a beast-type companion, make sure that they tank a couple hits to lose some health, and then use your 4th ability to heal them back up. This way, for me, it was pretty easy to get to the 350% cap, and as soon as you are at that cap, you don't need to worry about it anymore, because you can simply keep it up throughout the entire mission no problem, since the countdown will be reset every time that you cast your 4. I personally chose the Panzerwelperpfeiler as my companion because he provides a nice bit of viral priming. This right here would be my Welperpfeiler build, but, and this is very important, also your companions receive the 75% damage reduction from your 4, meaning ideally you don't want to build armor on your companion because that would then also create the problem where they have so much damage reduction that they don't lose health. So go ahead, give them a bit of maximum health so they can't get nuked away, but no armor because they need to lose that health for you to be able to build your crit buff. Or alternatively, but that's of course an absolutely absurd suggestion, you could just play with other people that you could heal. That of course would work too. But alright, now that we've solved the problem with our crit buff, let's get back into the build. On this build, I used a helmet ability and put it in the first slot. Reason for that is that we cannot use our first ability because that would heal allies, and we want to make sure to heal our allies with the 4 for the crit buff, so we can also just go ahead and throw it out. As for which helmet ability to use, you're free to go with whatever you like, but because I wanted to make this build ridiculously tanky, I went ahead and used Eclipse from Mirage for another 75% damage reduction on top. It's overkill, I'm well aware of that, but I wanted to make a build with funny numbers. Next, let's quickly talk about the Archon shards, which are very straightforward. I went for 3 blue ones to increase the maximum energy so we don't have to use a flow mod, effectively opening up 1 mod slot, as well as 2 reds for more duration, keeping all our damage reducing skills up for a little bit longer. However, especially the 2 red ones, you're free to replace them with whatever you like, the duration is not a must here. But alright, let's now go and look at the mods. First of all, we want to have a little bit of ability strength just to make sure that all our skills are maxed out in terms of how much damage reduction they can give us. That's why I use Blind Rage as well as Growing Power in the aura. Next, I went absolutely ham on duration because it is just so incredibly convenient to not have to recast all those buffs all the time. So we go for Narrow-Minded, Prime Continuity, and Mold Efficiency. Because this is a shield tanking build, we go for Primed Redirection, and then I used all 3 augment mods, Vampire Leech to get more overshields, Champion's Blessing for the crit, as well as a Baiting Link for the armor strip. However, especially Vampire Leech is a bit of an optional one here. You could also go ahead and use Adaptation instead of this to get even more tankiness. However, in that case you would not get overshield, so it's kind of your personal preference. Lastly, we go for Stretch and Cunning Drift to compensate for the negative range that Narrow-Minded brings with it, and to get even more crit chance on top, we go with Arcane Avenger in the second Arcane slot. Yes, this doesn't only work on health, but also on shields damage, so we don't have a problem. This then here would be the full build. I am totally aware that this is probably not the most exquisite Trinity build on the market, but to me it was just insanely funny to stand in the middle of dozens of Steel Path enemies and barely taking any damage. Like, the tankiness and the crit potential of this is absolutely stunning, and the armor strip helps as well. So much for the quote-unquote gunrunner build. Let's now take a look at the room nuking one, which isn't really all that new, and many other people have already talked about it in the past. But since we're making a Trinity video today, I thought, why don't I just go and give my own spin on it? Here we go. First of all, the premise of this build is using the helmet ability marked for death. With this, you mark one enemy and then the next damage that they take will be dealt to all the enemies in an AoE around them. On this build, what we're doing is we cast this on an enemy and then cast Energy Vampire afterwards. This then, dealing true damage as a percentage of the enemy health, will be quite a lot and scales perfectly with the enemy level, even up to level cap. And as you also see in the background right here, it will nuke away everybody around this enemy. First of all, we again need a whole lot of ability strength just to make sure that the percentage of damage that we're dealing outwards is as high as possible. So, Growing Power in the Aura, Transient Fortitude, Blind Rage, Umbler Intensify, and Mold Augmented. Then, of course, we want to make sure that we have some range on the AoE of Mark for Death, so we go with Stretch as well as Cunning Drift. And then I personally like this build to be a bit more into the shield tanky direction. However, if you personally want to take this to level cap, then the approach would be a teensy tiny bit different here. I went for Primed Redirection again to have a big shield pool. Then Adaptation for more damage reduction, Vampire Leech in order to create overshields, as well as Arcane Aegis in the second Arcane slot to have another safety net of constantly regenerating shields. This way, your shields will be resistant enough against standard Steel Path enemy levels so that you don't have to constantly shield gate to stay alive. But as I said previously, if you wanted to take this to level cap, you would replace Adaptation with Rolling Guard, and instead of Vampire Leech and Arcane Aegis, you could go with whatever you like. This right here would be the full build. However, if you just copy this build and play it in practice, it is probably not going to work out because you lack one crucial component, and that is viral priming. And for this, you can use pretty much whatever you like. You could go Panzerwallprofiler for the passive priming, you could go with any weapon of your choice. I personally went with a Torrid Incarnon, purely built into viral and into priming, just because it has this insanely crazy group status priming capability. This right here is the Torrid build that I'm using in this video, and with this, it's very easy. You go into your room, viral prime the enemies, cast Mark for Death on one, then Energy Vampire, and poof, everybody around you will be dead. Because of the fact that we have very low duration with Transient Fortitude and Fleeting Expertise, that means the energy pulses from Energy Vampire are going to come out very quickly, so it's easy to stay at full energy all the time. But one very big tip that I want to give here is, if you intend on playing this build, please go into the options menu and turn off the damage numbers, because they would completely block the screen and it would make it very difficult for you to actually cast Mark for Death and then Energy Vampire on the same enemy when they are in the middle of a crowd. You're just not gonna see what you're actually aiming at. And if you now also want to check out everything about the brand new Warframe Site 09, then you can do so in this video right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nos Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Lyca and Shepherd, Ondakanio2, Pepper Wolf, Streamjet21, SignUpKing5000, Mihawk HE, Yagis, Hoke Hunter, Noob Phoenix, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.